It takes a minute for everybody to file in anyway. I've noticed especially when you have as many people registered as we have, it took a good 60 seconds for 200 people to enter the room earlier. So
Well, it's going up pretty quick. I see 88.
yeah, we're going to give them a second to get in here.
Okay.
Come in, come in. Hello, hello. Come on in and have a seat.
Arf, 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 arf.
I'm sure they were rolling their eyes at my comedic humor in the opening earlier. Marie fancies herself a comedian. Okay, Natasha, I see that. I'll check on it, okay? Make a note. Okay, folks. Everybody else will kind of stream in here in a minute. Let's go ahead and get started. So we have the pleasure today of having Paul Carey here, whose hair is longer than his picture, but otherwise he pretty much looks the same. I'm not going to we're not doing bios per se this year in the session so that we can have all the time that we want with our speakers. His amazing, incredible bio is in the speaker section, so you can take a look at it. If you've been around, you know who this person is anyway, and that's why you are sitting in this room right now, because you know that you want to hear Paul Carey talk. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Paul so he can get started and we can spend all the time hearing him instead of hearing me.
Thank you, Marie, and good afternoon, Tennessee. Once again, my name is Paul Carey, and I'm broadcasting from my home in Columbia, Missouri. It's kind of a partly cloudy day in central Missouri. I think the high is supposed to be around 67, so not bad at all. I guess I should start with the fact that the pandemic has resulted in a lot of changes in all of our lives. I know some of you probably read some books during the lockdown and became smarter. I'm sure that many of you became teachers as your kids were out of school and you were homeschooling and juggling video conferences and video learning. I know at least a couple of people who went on diets and lost weight. For my part, the only thing that has changed is my appearance. Because of the lockdown, I have not had a haircut in 7 months. And so I kind of have a rather woolly appearance. If you looked at the headshot in where my bio is, I look pretty much nothing like I look right now. But I can tell you that the first person that says I look like a homeless guy is getting kicked off this Zoom big time. I've had both my Moderna vaccine shots, and so on Friday I go get a haircut. Yahoo! Anyway, thank you for joining me this afternoon. I really appreciate your attendance. I hope to return the favor by giving you some helpful and useful information. So if everybody's ready, let's go ahead and get started. As the title slide says, we're going to be talking about drug testing specimens, and we're going to work through the list of specimens, try to figure out what works best in a treatment court environment, and what has happened maybe during the pandemic to change those parameters or those dynamics. So let's look at the effect that the pandemic has had. Pre-COVID, urine was the specimen of choice in the vast majority of treatment courts. And there's good reasons, and we'll review them, why urine is the specimen of choice for a criminal justice treatment court environment. But in March of 2020, of course, everything changed with the pandemic. The first thing that came about was social distancing. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but before March 2020, I'd never even heard the term social distancing, and all of a sudden it became a meme, and everybody knew what social distancing meant and how to follow the social distancing guidelines. And because there's this 6 foot parameter in terms of keeping your distance 6 feet from another person, that made collecting urine samples kind of difficult. A lot of the courts that you work in closed as the courthouse themselves closed for both civil cases, criminal cases, and certainly for treatment court programs. And so the treatment court program milieu, it was totally upended. It was totally changed. It was turned on its head. And so a lot of what has occurred forced the treatment court to re-examine what specimens they were going to use to drug test and absence monitor their participants. Now, there were some circumstances, quite frankly, where courts actually stopped drug testing altogether. And that obviously caused some of its own problems. But many drug courts essentially went on a search to figure out what it is they were going to use for drug testing, and we'll explore some of those options as we move through the presentation. So, the search for alternative specimens led perhaps to breath for primarily alcohol testing. Sweat patch monitoring became an option for many courts. Oral fluids became an option for treatment courts. Hair was a sample that was investigated, hair drug testing, and the ability to go back retrospectively up to 90 days. And then there were other specimens, let's see, fingernails, toenails, earwax, belly button lint, and okay, I made up the last couple, but certainly the options for drug testing certainly became open in terms of the types of specimens that we might use in a treatment court environment. One of the things to remember about these specimens, breath, sweat, oral fluids, and hair, is that these specimens are not new. These specimens have been used in criminal justice and in treatment courts for a very long time. What was new, however, was that courts were now faced with determining how these samples were going to be collected, whether it was going to be done by court staff, whether it was going to be done by some contracted third-party collector. And so all of a sudden, there were questions about these new specimens or these alternative specimens that the court had to address. Certainly collection was one of them. The next question that had to be addressed is who was going to do the testing? You probably already had an established relationship with a laboratory where you sent the urine samples, the testing was done, everything was working smoothly, and now all of a sudden you decided you were going to use a sweat patch. Well, that meant contracting with a different vendor, contracting with a different laboratory, getting results back from these entities. And so that whole situation changed in terms of who was actually going to provide you with the analytical service, with the testing service in terms of providing you with results. And perhaps the biggest change in moving toward one of these alternative samples, whether it was sweat or oral fluids or whatever, was interpretation of results. The courts had essentially become very comfortable with interpreting, evaluating, and assessing what the urine drug testing results meant and how it impacted your therapeutic intervention strategies. All of a sudden, now you're working with a different matrix. You're working with sweat. You're working with oral fluids. Now the results may be unfamiliar to you. And it may also be that they were using different cutoffs. And now it was that what did this result mean in relationship to when the sample was taken and how long the detection window is for that particular sample? So that was all new to the treatment court. And I got scads of questions with regards to, okay, here we used to use urine. Here's the result in the new specimen. What the heck does this mean? All right, let's take a step back first. One of the things that I want you to remember when we're talking about specimens for treatment court provision of services is to describe the characteristics of a good specimen, to describe the characteristic of a good drug test. Obviously, we want a test that is scientifically valid, that uses strategies and techniques and methodologies that are accepted by the scientific community, that have been published in the scientific literature, that have been determined by these scientists as providing accurate and reliable results. That's pretty clear. We also, criteria number two, we also want to have results that are legally defensible. In other words, they're able to withstand challenge. They have a court record. There's case law behind them, that these testing methods, whatever they are, in whatever specimen we're testing, have been scrutinized by the legal and judicial community as producing, again, accurate and reliable results. But those first two, scientifically valid and legally defensible, they could apply to any forensic test. They could apply to latent prints in a forgery case. They could be the same criteria that you would use for gunshot residue analysis in a homicide case, or serology testing in a rape case. In a treatment court, not only do the tests and the specimen have to produce scientifically valid results that are legally defendable, but these results and these specimens have to be therapeutically beneficial. And what I mean by that is that the results have to come back to you in a time frame where you can use those results effectively to intervene therapeutically to change undesired behavior or promote the recovery process. And so it's important that whatever sample you use, whatever testing approach that you use, that the results come back in a rapid fashion so that you can intervene to change behaviors. So as we look at the different specimens that we're going to review moving forward, they should meet all three of those criteria. All right, so when we talk about drug testing specimens, we need to make sure of a couple of things. First of all, there is no perfect specimen. Even though urine is the specimen of choice, it has been the specimen of choice for treatment court absence monitoring for decades. Okay, there is no perfect specimen. We're not going to be able to go out there and find a matrix that is perfectly suited for treatment court environments and use with the participants in your court. Each specimen has its advantages and disadvantages, pros and cons. And so you need to accept that as the first premise of choosing a specimen. The other thing that's important to remember is that each specimen takes a slightly different picture of someone's drug use profile. So that if for some reason in your court you're using two different specimens, they could be taking, they could have different detection windows and be taking a different photograph basically of someone's drug use history. We'll talk about that more later. But one thing I will tell you right off the top is that whenever you use two different samples, two different specimens, such as urine and oral fluids, or urine and sweat testing, or whatever, that the potential for discrepant results increases. Not because either test is wrong, but just because you may be taking a different slice in a drug detection window than another specimen. We'll talk about more about that in a little bit. All right, so let's talk about your drug testing specimens. All right. Let's once again, not to beat a dead horse, but once again, urine is the specimen of choice for monitoring abstinence in your clients in a treatment court environment. And here are the advantages that I list for urine. Urine provides detection in both recent, in cases of both recent and past substance usage. Urine is generally available in large quantities. There are numerous testing options. You can test in a reference lab where you're sending the sample off, or you can test the sample using an on-site device. Drugs and drug metabolites are concentrated in a urine sample, and so the drugs that are prohibited by the court are easily detectable and identified. And because urine has been used as the specimen of choice for decades, going back 40, maybe even 50 years in some cases, the criteria for supporting their use in a legal and a court environment, those criteria are now uniform and accepted by the courts, and they're accepted for the types of case adjudication that you're going to be doing in your treatment court environment. But as I said, each specimen has advantages and, in this case, disadvantages. The disadvantages of urine include invasive witness collection. You have to direct observation of the collection of the sample because of the denial component of a substance use disorder. So that requires gender same collections. Because the specimen is susceptible to tampering, you have to do those witnessed observations. Drug concentration is influenced by fluid intake, and so you can't really use drug levels in urine to interpret the drug use history or the drug use behavior of someone that you're testing. So advantages and disadvantages for urine. Okay, so let's follow that same pattern for each of the alternative samples, and let's start with breath. The advantages of breath testing include portable monitoring devices. The whole thing about PBTs is that you can take them into the field and use them when relapse is likely to occur. I know this is going to come as a shock to everyone within the sound of my voice, but the use of prohibited substances takes place other than 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. And so one of the advantages of having a portable device is that you can go to those opportunities where people are likely to relapse and identify a potential alcohol usage using a portable device. Portable devices are easy to use, excellent approach for alcohol surveillance, again, outside of non-governmental hours. And it can be used in the field for unannounced, unanticipated testing, particularly if behavioral signs indicate perhaps relapse of drug of choice alcohol. It may be helpful to do that type of unannounced testing. Disadvantages include a pre-test waiting and observation period. Now, you're going to have to go to the instruction manual or the user's manual for your individual device and find out what that is. But most of these devices require some waiting period so that you can determine that the client or the participant doesn't put anything in their mouth prior to the actual testing event. The other thing you should note is that all of these devices require some sort of periodic calibration. I have seen where programs are using devices that haven't been calibrated in some cases in years. And so the results that you may be getting may be skewed one way or another because the device hasn't been recalibrated to ensure accuracy. So again, go to your procedure manual, go to the user's information, or go online with whatever the model number and serial number of the device you have, and check to make sure that you are appropriately calibrating it at regular intervals. Okay, advantages and disadvantages again for sweat patch testing. The advantages include the ability to monitor 24/7 for extended periods. Now, if anybody is not clear on what a sweat patch is, it's kind of like a huge bandage that fits on maybe someone's arm or maybe the small of their back. It's got a pad inside which collects perspiration or sweat. And then at regular intervals, you can remove that collection device, send it to a laboratory for analysis. Sweat patches are relatively client tamper-proof. They have a tamper-proof thin shield that covers the pad that absorbs the perspiration. It's the same consistency or material that a security seal is. So if the client tries to tamper with it, it shreds, and the tampering would be evident. Sweat patch testing is relatively non-invasive. It increases deterrent to drug use because it's actually sitting on someone's arm 24/7 saying, hey, I'm here. If you use a prohibited substance, it's going to be detected by the patch. So it's a device, it's a strategy that really reinforces deterrence. So it's a nice adjunct to therapy in that regard. And the last advantage is that you can you can use cross-gender collections. The patch can be put on a male or a female by a male or a female. Disadvantages of sweat patch testing include poor past usage drug detection. So drug use that occurred prior to the application of the patch is not well detected. Limited collection devices and testing facilities. Patch application and removal requires certified collectors. There's actually a course. It can be done online. It can be done virtually, but the person that you are hiring to apply the patch and then remove the patch has to be a certified to perform that activity, because the greatest risk of contamination of the patch is the application and removal. If not done appropriately, you can get a false positive result. Again, there is a limited number of drugs detected by this technology, and certainly there is no on-site testing. A lot of programs move to a sweat patch in the pandemic due to the fact that it didn't require interfacing with the participant except every 2 weeks, for example. The application and the wearing of the patch is FDA approved for up to 2 weeks. And therefore it only involved limited interaction with the participant and allowed the social distancing that was part of the restrictions associated with the pandemic. Hair. Well, the advantages of hair include an extended detection window of up to 90 days. And so hair sample can go back retrospectively 90 days to determine whether or not someone has utilized a prohibited substance. Again, non-invasive, cross-gender collection, same as sweat patch testing. Reduced specimen tampering. Unlike urine and unlike oral fluids to some extent, the sample, the potential for tampering with a hair sample is much reduced. Now, of course, that said, the potential still exists for, if you institute hair testing, what's the first thing your participants are going to do? They're going to shave their head. Or they're going to go out and they're going to repeatedly bleach it and destroy the hair shafts in an attempt to beat your monitoring efforts. So it's not that it's totally devoid of tampering, but the tampering strategies are quite obvious, and you as a member of the treatment court are certainly going to know that. And of course, one of the advantages of testing in hair is that there is no poppy seed interference, as there is in urine. Disadvantages may include increased cost for the testing, the inability to detect recent usage. And let me explain that. If an individual uses a drug, let's say on day 1, it may take 10 to 14 days for that particular hair shaft to grow out of the hole on the scalp called the follicle in order to be clipped off and sent into a laboratory for detection. If you clip it off sooner than that, the hair material containing the drug use event from day 1 may still be below the scalp and therefore not detectable. So if you collect a hair sample on any given day, okay, you're not going to be able to detect that very recent usage because it hasn't gotten to the place where the hair has grown out of the follicle, grown above the scalp level to be sent in to be detected. Limited number of testing facilities, no on-site testing, and laboratories report, and the research reports that drug testing may not be able to detect a single-use event. That hair testing is more reliable at detecting multiple use events. So not a slip, but a true relapse where multiple drug use events over a series of days has taken place. A hair sample is much more likely to detect those multiple usage than a single event usage. Okay, so now we're moving on to oral fluids, and the advantages of oral fluids again are that you can it can be non-invasive cross-gender collections. Specimen tampering is again also reduced from urine. On-site testing is available. Oral fluid swabs that give you an instant result are available, but they are not recommended, or I don't recommend them certainly. And I'll talk about that when we get to the disadvantage stage. And then recent advances in oral fluids have actually extended the detection window and have included more drugs being detected. So these advances have occurred in the last several years. But as we'll learn in the disadvantages, there are still some limitations associated with that detection window. So non-invasive, cross-gender, reduced sample, and extended detection window, and more drugs detected. Disadvantages, if there's an Achilles heel of oral fluid testing, it is the short detection window. Now, I know you're going to see laboratories, reference laboratories, that say they can detect drugs in oral fluid up to 72 hours. But so the language there is it needs to be carefully examined. Up to 72 hours. Well, if they detected drugs for 8 hours, that's up to 72 hours. It's just that it's within that window from 0 to 72. If you look at the research, and we'll examine this a little bit more in a second, but if you look at the research, most drugs are detectable for an average of 24 hours, some shorter, some longer. But the average is only 24 hours, even if the laboratory tells you that the detection window is up to 72 hours. Is it possible that it may be up to 72 hours if conditions are right and circumstances are absolutely perfect, and you've caught the drug use right after it happened and they're using the most sensitive methods? Perhaps. But in terms of looking at the results realistically and pragmatically, you should consider the detection window about 24 hours. Disadvantages include limited collection devices and testing facilities, limited number of drugs detected, and the on-site devices, the instant oral fluid rapid testing devices. Most of them are not FDA approved, Food and Drug Administration. So they haven't even met the minimal benchmark for being forensically acceptable. So I have major concerns about using oral swabs that give you an instant answer as to their accuracy and reliability. And certainly I would not adjudicate anyone's case based on an instant oral fluid device. Collect the oral fluids, send them to a laboratory where you can get accurate and reliable results. One of the unique aspects of the pandemic and oral fluids as a specimen was that several companies introduced ways and methods of actually video monitoring the collection of the oral fluids using an iPhone app and a telemedicine through a computer program. So what would happen is that the laboratory would send the sealed oral fluid collection device to the participant. with a serial number and a specific information on how to collect the sample. The participant would hold it until they got notified that they had to take the test, and so then they would get on one of these video monitoring devices or a telemedicine viewing application of some kind. They would collect the oral fluid in front of the camera. They would put it back in the receptacle. They would seal it up. They would put it in the mailer. They would seal up the mailer, and then they would go off camera and would put it in the mail at some point. So, obviously you can't really do that with sweat or with urine or with hair. But so the oral fluid collecting process during the pandemic using one of these strategies was a unique aspect, and is still available from certain companies. We talked about this early on in the program, but let me go back to it. And this applies to a court or a program that is testing multiple specimens. So they're testing urine and sweat. They're testing oral fluids and sweat. They're testing hair and oral fluids, or whatever the combination is. And as I mentioned earlier, whenever you use multiple testing specimens, the probability of getting discrepant results increases relatively significantly. And it's not because either one of the tests is wrong. It can be that both tests are absolutely accurate. It's just that they're taking a different picture of someone's drug use profile. They're taking a different slice of that detection windows. And so courts need to be aware of that. If they feel confident and competent in the laboratories that they're using for testing multiple specimens, and they get discrepant results, don't just assume that the one result that's positive and the one result that's negative, that the negative result is wrong, or even that the positive result is wrong. You have to spend some time examining when those samples were taken, what their detection window is, and whether or not they both may be accurate, and yet they've taken different pictures of someone's drug use profile. All right, so let's look now at specimen choices, and if there are therapeutic concerns associated with the specific choices that we're making. And let's first examine urine versus oral fluids. And I mentioned a few slides back about the detection window associated with oral fluids. And I made the comment that oral fluid detection is on average about 24 hours. But let's now look at some specific drugs and their detection windows in urine versus what we might see in oral fluids. All right, so let's start with opiates. And what you can see here in urine at a 300 nanogram level is the detection window is somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 5 days. And that really depends, obviously, on the type of opiate that's being used, the chronicity of use. Is it a single use event or multiple uses, so on and so forth. But that's sort of a good average. Look what happens when we go to oral fluids. The detection window is, even though we're testing at a more sensitive level, the detection window in oral fluids is only 12 to 24 hours for opiate drugs. Now, as I said, you may have laboratories that are telling you that their detection window for oral fluids is up to 72 hours. I am not using laboratory advertising data to present these claims. This is data that I have accrued from the American Society for Addiction Medicine. This is their data from their research in terms of how long drugs are detectable in oral fluids. Let's pick another drug here. How about cocaine? We're detecting cocaine based on its metabolite, BZE, urine 1 to 4 days. Again, in oral fluids at a much lower detection limit, 12 to 24 hours. Amphetamines, urine 2 to 4 days, oral fluids 1 to 2 days. Marijuana. Let's stick with single use event as opposed to chronic use. I'm hoping that heavy chronic use in your programs is not occurring. So for at the 50 nanogram level, if that's your cutoff, for urine cannabinoids, 3 to 4 days. At the 20 nanogram level, cutoff level for testing, for a single use event, detection window 7 days. Look what happens in oral fluids. Only 8 hours. So basically what that's telling you is if I smoked marijuana, let's say yesterday sometime, and you collected my oral fluid today, that means I would probably test negative. That's the kind of thing you have to keep in mind when you're using oral fluids in a treatment court where therapeutic impact is you have to assess whether or not someone is remaining abstinent. You can't intervene to change behavior unless you know someone is using a prohibited substance. And so that's the big disadvantage of oral fluids. Now, if you do oral fluid testing every single day, your court's probably going to be okay, but that may not be a reasonable expectation. Timing is everything. We know that timing, and this is a behavioral modification tenet that goes back decades before treatment courts were even the gleam in someone's eye. Timing is one of those influential factors to behavior modification. The sooner sanctions are delivered after an infraction, the sooner rewards are given or incentives are given after an achievement, the better the results overall at modifying and solidifying good behavior. So if you can't intervene to change behavior in a timely fashion, your success at modifying undesired behavior is limited. Why am I telling you all this? Because let's go and talk about hair and the therapeutic impact of hair in a treatment, a court environment. So let me give you a scenario. Okay, participant uses a banned substance on day 1, okay? And the hair sample is, and maybe you get some subjective information from somewhere in the court, family member, another participant, treatment, whatever. And they say, we have some suspicions that this individual is using and that they used around this time period. So you wait 2 weeks, because you know it takes 2 weeks for the hair to grow out of the scalp where it can be cut off, collected, sent into a laboratory and detected. So you wait the 2-week period. And so you collect the hair on day 14. Okay, so you're doing your part to make sure that the hair sample that you've tested or that you've cut off and sent into the laboratory is going to accurately reflect the usage that may have occurred 2 weeks earlier. Okay. So you send it off to the laboratory and maybe it comes back on day 18, okay? And it comes back with a positive result. So now you go out and you call the client or email the client or text the client, and the client comes in for some face-to-face meeting with probation or with a caseworker or with treatment or whoever. And so now we're at day 20. So we're now almost 3 weeks out. You confront the individual with the positive result. Okay, there's 2 possibilities. Let's say that the client denies the result. So now you're going to have to go back and do further testing and maybe confirmation of the hair or whatever. But let's say best case scenario that the participant actually self-reports. And yeah, let's see, 3 weeks ago, did I use that banned substance? Well, yeah, I think I did. All right. So now what are you going to do? Remember, timing is everything. The sooner that you sanction someone for banned behavior, the more likely you are to change or be successful at changing that behavior. Okay. What kind of therapeutic effect do you think sanctioning somebody 3 weeks after a prohibited drug use event occurred? What do you think the therapeutic impact of that sanction is going to be 3 weeks after the event? Well, I would suggest to you that if there's any effect at all, it's going to be extremely limited. And so this is one of the reasons why hair, yes, it may be a testing approach that is scientifically valid. Yes, it may in fact be legally defensible, but is it therapeutically beneficial? Remember those criteria we talked about? Legally defensible, accepted by the scientific community as producing accurate, reliable results, but it also in a treatment court has to be therapeutically beneficial. And I would argue to you that perhaps hair testing in this environment is not terribly therapeutically useful. So this gives you sort of an illustration of that detection timeline. Again, we're looking at drug use on this first day, day 1. And then day 14 is this collection period. So this here, this line is the timeline, okay? And that detection window, we know, is up to 90 days. Okay, so what does that mean for collecting another sample? Let's say we're going to be using hair, and we've gotten some positive result that occurred, maybe somewhere in this period of time. Now we got to make a decision as to when to collect the next sample. Well, we can't collect it before the end of the 90-day window, because if we collect a sample at this juncture, how do we know, since the detection window is 90 days, how do we know that if we collect a sample at this point, how do we know we're not detecting the drug use from way back here? So we have to, in order to collect that second sample, we have to at least wait 90 days. And I would argue that maybe if you build in a safety margin, maybe you don't collect a sample for 100 days or maybe even 120 days. So I guess the message I'm trying to send is that hair testing is kind of a one-shot approach. You can't do it very often because of the fact that detection window is 90 days. Now, some people will look at that 90-day detection window and say, that's great, I can go back 90 days to figure out whether someone is used. But the downside of that is that it really limits your ability to go back and collect a second sample any sooner than maybe 100 days. The last thing I want to say about hair testing is that some courts have actually instituted a hair drug test as sort of a final test. And what I mean by that is that the court has instituted a program where, in order to graduate, someone has to successfully pass a hair test, or for someone to advance from, let's say, phase 3 to phase 4, or phase 2 to phase 3, they have to successfully pass a hair test. So this would be using a hair test as sort of a benchmark in order to move on in the program or in order to graduate. But maybe at the same time, this court has been using urine as the testing sample. So before they did the hair test as sort of this final test, they've been using urine all the way along. And I'm assuming if this person is ready to graduate or ready for phase advancement, that they have reached some threshold where they've been testing all this time as negative when using a urine sample. And now all of a sudden you institute the hair test, and the hair test comes back as positive. This person's ready to graduate. They're ready to phase advance. Been doing urine testing. All of it's negative. Then they do the hair test, and all of a sudden it's positive. Well, that's going to pose a whole lot of questions for the court. Which was accurate, the urine testing or the hair testing? If we decide that the urine testing may not have accurately reflected the drug use history of this person, why not? Was the person tampering with the sample? Were our collectors not being vigilant in terms of witnessing the sample collection? So now we can't trust the results. And what are we going to do? What are we going to do with the positive hair test? Are we going to set the person back a phase? Are we not going to let them graduate? Um, all of these questions should be answered before you decide to use a hair test as a final test. Because as I indicated a few slides earlier, whenever you use two samples, the potential for discrepant results increases rather dramatically. And so if you're going to do this, then you need to address these discrepant results and answer the many questions that these discrepant results may raise prior to using hair as a final test. I don't tell you this to scare you. I don't tell you this to necessarily dissuade you of this practice. I don't think it's the best practice. But if you're going to use hair testing as a final test, you need to be aware of the limitations of this approach, and you need to be able to address the questions that come up associated with discrepant results. All right, result interpretations. One of the things that happened during the pandemic was people went to a different matrix. So they were doing urine and they went to sweat. They were doing urine and they went to oral fluids. And what happens was they were getting results back on these new specimens, or at least new to the courts that began using them. And all of a sudden, people were scratching their heads. People were sending me emails and, oh, we've been, using urine all this time, and this person's been fine. And now we're using a different matrix, and we're getting different results, and their cutoff levels are different, and we don't know what these new results mean, and yada yada yada. And they represented a huge problem to many courts. They were very comfortable with urine and interpreting results and using them therapeutically. And all of a sudden now they're in a different matrix, and it's a hair on fire response. What are we going to do? What do these new results mean? Why are they screening at a much lower level? Why am I getting parent drug results but no metabolites? What's going on? Well, the first comment I would make would be that if you're going to use an alternative matrix, if you're going to move away from urine to one of these alternative samples, whereas before you were comfortable in the court interpreting the results from those samples, now you're going to have to depend on the laboratory that's doing your testing. You're going to have to hold their feet to the fire in helping you interpret the results. Some of these laboratories that do sweat testing and some of these laboratories that did oral fluids testing saw a real boom in business. All these courts and all these probation and parole departments and all of these court mandated drug testing entities all of a sudden couldn't do urine. And so they decided to use sweat, or they decided to use oral fluids. And so these laboratories, they reaped a harvest. But in doing that, they also need to understand that they have an obligation to help you interpret results. They have an obligation to assist you in using these results for a therapeutic end. I've said this in other venues, and I've said this when I do court evaluations. And in one case, a room full of people, and I made this statement, and half of them laughed. But the statement is this: the laboratory, your drug testing laboratory, works for you, the court, not the other way around. And so it's important that if you're paying somebody your hard-earned money to do a particular type of testing, they need to be sensitive to the fact that you may not be able to answer all the questions with regards to their results. And so you need to hold that laboratory's feet to the fire with regards to helping you interpret results. I'm just going to throw out an example of result interpretation and how it can get really complicated. All right, here's 4 scenarios of drug testing results in a hair sample. Okay, let's say that the results come back and the parent drug is below the cutoff and there are no metabolites. Okay, so the parent drug would be, let's say, methamphetamine, and the metabolite would be amphetamine. Okay, so methamphetamine may be there or may not be there below the cutoff, and there's no amphetamine. Well, this is a result that should be reported as negative. So that's a pretty easy interpretation. Okay. What if the parent drug is above the cutoff? So methamphetamine is above the cutoff, okay, but there are no metabolites. There's no methamphetamine. Now remember, these are hair results. One of the things that should be considered is that the hair is externally or environmentally contaminated with methamphetamine. Because if the individual was ingesting methamphetamine, was taking it into their body in some way, and that drug was being metabolized, there should be metabolites present. And so this is a result that needs some further examination. Is it environmental contamination? Were the hair samples externally contaminated? Does the laboratory that you're using for hair drug testing wash the hair before testing it so that they rule out environmental contamination? Okay. Result number 3. Parent drug is above the cutoff, so methamphetamine is above the cutoff, and the metabolite, okay, so this would be amphetamine, is also above the cutoff. Well, there are 2 possibilities for this result. This result showing both parent drug and metabolite above the cutoff may be entirely consistent with use of a prohibited substance. But what if the ratio between parent drug and metabolite is something like, well, let's say the parent drug is there at 95% and the metabolite is there at only 5%. Well, that may mean that that hair sample is still contaminated because there isn't sufficient metabolite to render the sample as positive, consistent with use. 4th possible scenario, parent drug is below the cutoff, but the metabolite is above the cutoff. So amphetamine is below the cutoff, methamphetamine is below the cutoff, metabolite is above the cutoff. This is probably consistent with use of prohibited substance. I don't lay this out here to confuse you. I don't lay this possible scenario out there to just blow your mind. You go, God, I'm never doing hair testing again. It's to let you know how complicated the interpretation of laboratory results can be. And this is why you need to depend on your laboratory to assist you to make the appropriate call when you're talking about testing of a different matrix other than urine. One more time with feeling. Urine is the specimen of choice for treatment courts. And it's not perfect. We've already gone through the advantages and disadvantages, but it is the treatment of choice for use of abscess monitoring in a treatment court environment. And what I'm hoping is that as we come out of the pandemic, that one of the things that will occur is that courts will feel more comfortable going back and using urine for their primary specimen, that they can go back in and we don't have to social distance. And as we reach herd immunity, that we feel comfortable, even if we're still masking and even if the participant is still masking, that we feel comfortable in observing the collections and going back to urine, which is a sample that we're comfortable interpreting the data from. Another alternative to courts is to farm out the collection of that urine sample to a third-party collector so that the court is not involved. There are a number of services that are available to criminal justice and to treatment courts that will randomize the selection of samples. They will collect the urine sample. Some of these entities even do the testing. And so it's a bundle of services combined. So if you decide, yeah, I want to go back to urine, but I just don't feel comfortable engaging in the collection process, then look for these services that will do the collections. Maybe they'll just do the collections, and then it'll be sent off to a laboratory of your choosing, or it may be a service that bundles both the collection and the testing. If you decide as a court that you just don't want to get back into the urine collection business, then consider one of those options. But I would encourage the treatment court to go back to urine as a specimen of choice. And it may be that in a few years, as these other specimens continue to advance and develop, that maybe there'll be other samples that will be considered specimen of choice. And don't misunderstand, I'm not talking about totally getting rid of all of the alternative samples, such as breath, or such as oral fluids, or such as hair, or such as sweat patch testing, because those can be integrated into a testing program to keep clients on their toes, to keep the testing unexpected and unanticipated by the client population, because then and only then are you going to uncover the actual propensity of drug use in the population that you're testing, by keeping the testing unexpected, unannounced, and unanticipated. So in summary, I'm hoping that many laboratories will return to urine drug testing, but to continue to consider alternative specimens and how they can play a role in keeping clients on their toes. Understand that each specimen has advantages and disadvantages, and we've gone through those. You will have the availability to have this presentation. It will be available from the conference organizers. We'll make sure they get a copy so you can go back and you can review those advantages and disadvantages, and also understand that the detection windows for each of those specimens may differ from another specimens. I encourage you to use the results therapeutically. You know, some courts get myopic about drug testing and all of the advantages, all of the sanctions and all of the rewards associated with the court are associated with positive and negative drug tests. And what I suggest is that even though drug testing is your one objective measure of abstinence compliance, the court is also getting lots of subjective information coming into the court with regards to a client's compliance with the program or lack thereof. And so use the results therapeutically to change undesirable behavior, or to reward behavior that is laudable because of multiple negative results over a period of time. And lastly, continue to seek advice and guidance from your testing facility or from experts on understanding and using these testing approaches. There's no way that I can answer, even though we're ending this session with about 15 minutes left. And I'm hoping Marie is going to come back on, and I'll answer some questions. But there's no way realistically that I can answer all the questions that may have come up with regards to this presentation. So I'm providing you with my email address so that you can reach out and ask me some questions. So it's Carrie P.L. This is an L, not a 1. Carrie P.L. at Missouri spelled out .edu, Edward David Union. So if you have questions, or after reviewing the PowerPoint, once I send it to the conference organizers, if you see questions, have concerns, it raises some issues, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I'll try to answer your questions. So Marie, there she is. Do we have questions that need to be addressed at this juncture?
We do have 3 questions if you want to take a stab in the next few minutes at them.
Sure.
So Paula is asking about washing hair in vinegar. And that was early on. So Paula, I don't know if you want to.
My sense is that vinegar, which is an acid, right? It's acetic acid. It's mildly acidic, is probably not going to change the dynamics of the hair shaft sufficiently to change the result of a drug test. Remember that the drugs that are being tested in hair are actually on the inside of the hair shaft, not on the outside. So things that you do to the outside of the hair generally are not going to impact the results. The drug deposits are in that cortex, in that center part of the hair. They're not in the sheath, the outside of the hair. So the only way that you can change the result of the hair shaft is to damage it in some way so that the cortex, the inside of the hair, becomes opened up where the drugs can somehow be eliminated. So when in the presentation, I mentioned repeated bleaching of the hair, which may actually damage the hair shaft to the point where the cortex is open now and available for leaching the drugs out of the hair. But just rinsing the hair with vinegar should not change the result of a drug test in hair.
Okay. Rachel Roden said, we recently had a positive urine screen for opiates return positive from the lab. Our participant has continued to deny use even after lab confirmed. Is there anything you are aware of that will test positive for opiates other than opiates, like new designer drugs, perhaps?
Well, okay, I'm going to have a little trouble answering that question because I don't know what opiate we're talking about. If it was confirmed for opiates, it would have been confirmed for a specific drug. So it would have been confirmed for morphine. It would have been confirmed for the heroin metabolite 6-AM. It would have been confirmed for hydrocodone. It's difficult for me to answer that question without knowing the specific drug it was confirmed for.
Rachel's mic is on if she wants to answer.
I'm trying to find them.
Four
of them.
Gotcha.
Okay, I'm sorry.
She's in a room with reverb. So maybe if you want to try to put that in chat or whatever, Rachel, we'll go on to the next question. When you stated that the oral testing was AMPH.
Oh, amphetamine.
For amphetamine was 1 to 2 days detection. Is that for orals that go to labs or just instant test?
Okay, read the question again.
When you stated that the oral testing for amphetamines was 1 to 2 days detection, is that for orals that go to labs or just instant test?
I don't have any data for instant tests, and the American Society of Addiction Medicine, in that graph that I showed, all of that data was lab data. There was no data from instant tests, and I don't know that there's any good research out there that addresses the detection window in instant oral fluid tests. So that's all lab data.
Okay. Coming back to Rachel, I don't know, maybe this is not going to be answered either. She says there were 4 that it tested for, and it didn't specify in the test.
All right.
Well, so there must have been 4 opiates that were tested for, and it didn't specify.
Okay. Well, okay. Have Rachel reach out to me by email, and have Rachel send me a copy, a redacted copy of the laboratory report, so that I can look at it and try to assist you.
Your view on clients using baking soda for trying to pass drug screens?
A great question. I get this question all the time, and it has vexed me for years. Because I bet once a month on a regular basis, I get a question about baking soda. Okay. Baking soda is sodium bicarbonate. And so the theory is that if you mix sodium bicarbonate or baking soda with water and drink it, that somehow it will speed up the elimination, particularly of amphetamines and methamphetamines. I know of absolutely no publication that would support this theory. I have reached out to lab directors of drug testing laboratories, and none of them have anything can support the fact that baking soda can change the result of a drug test. But I will tell you that I also know that participants always brag about being able to change the result of their drug test by drinking or eating baking soda. And my only theory associated with that is that you will have participants brag about their successes or their perceived successes all the time, but you rarely have participants that brag about their failures. Oh, I tried to eat lots of bacon and it increased my metabolism of PCP, and that's why I tested negative. No. Clients will brag about their successes. They won't brag about their failures. And my sense is that if a client is bragging about their success associated with baking soda, that they may have tested negative regardless of whether or not they ate or drank the baking soda or not. But there is absolutely no research, no studies, no information that I have been able to glean that supports the theory that baking soda has the ability to either cover up a drug test and change the result, or enhance the elimination of drugs so that the individual tests clean more rapidly.
Can you touch on marijuana secondhand smoke in urine?
Yes, I certainly can. The feds have done some very elegant research in this regard. And what they did was they took old smoking machines that they used for tar and nicotine studies associated with cigarette use. And they smoked a whole bunch of marijuana, and they pumped it into a small room. I think it was 8 by 8 by 8. And then they went out and found some really unlucky volunteers and put them into the small booth. And they sat there for hours in this intense marijuana smoke. The marijuana smoke was so thick and so intense that the study subjects had to wear eye goggles because the smoke was so intense. And not one of those participants got above 7 nanograms per mil in urine. So if you're using the traditional screening cutoffs of either 50 or at 20, passive inhalation is not a legitimate excuse for a positive test. But hold the bus. You can sit there and argue to a client about the science associated with passive inhalation. We can get studies about, people sitting in small booths with intense marijuana smoke. You can argue the science. Or you can choose to sanction an individual for a self-report of a court violation. Participants are not supposed to be in environments where passive inhalation is a possibility. And so the fact that they've admitted being in a prohibited environment should be sufficient to sanction or therapeutically intervene to change that behavior. So, I mean, yeah, you can go ahead, you can argue all the science and yada yada about why it's not possible to get a positive marijuana screen from passive inhalation, or you can directly confront the violation of court rules and the behavior and address it that way.
And Rachel's back, and she said she found it in small print. It says codeine.
Okay. Thanks, Rachel. All right. So here's what happens. The only way to get codeine, well, maybe there are two possibilities. One way to get codeine is obviously to take a medication that has codeine in it. But generally speaking, if that were the case, you would also see morphine. Morphine is a metabolite of codeine. So if the codeine is there, certainly the morphine should be there. The other possibility for a positive codeine test would be from poppy seeds. Poppy seeds come from the same botanical origin as heroin. They come from the poppy plant. So it should come as no surprise that poppy seeds have trace amounts of both codeine and morphine. Generally speaking, however, poppy seeds contain a higher concentration of morphine than they do codeine. So, I mean, this result is a little odd, but those are the two sources for codeine: poppy seed ingestion or a medication that includes codeine as a drug.
Excellent. And that's it.
Okay.
You answered those.
Well, first, let me thank everybody for participating this afternoon. I really appreciate your attendance in a shameless self-promotion. In a few minutes, I'm going to be doing a second presentation, and this one is going to be on emerging drugs. So if you have an interest in emerging drugs, we're also going to talk about CBD. As well. So if you have any interest in that, you can join us in a few minutes. But again, thank you for your participation. I want everybody to wear your mask. I want everybody to go out and get vaccinated. I've had my 2 Moderna shots, and I'm ready to get a haircut. But I want everybody to go out and get their shots, go out and mask. And hopefully the next time I see you, it will not be virtual, and I'll give each of you a big hug.
Sounds like a good plan. I also want to say that when you email him a question, he is one of those people that answers it. So it's not going to end up in the abyss if you actually email Paul a question. So use the email address. He will respond to you. And again, thank you, Paul. We'll see you and whoever is going to come with us in the next session at 2:45.
Sounds good. Bye, everybody.